There we go. Want to call the meeting to order. The House Subcommittee, Appropriations Subcommittee on Corrections and Judiciary. Let's see. Clerk, I'd like to have you take attendance, please.
Chair Slaw.
Present.
Representatives Markinen.
Here.
Beeson.
Here.
Cavett.
Here.
O'Neill.
Present.
Mr. Chair, there's 5 members present, 0 members absent. A quorum is present.
Excellent, thank you. Let's see, I want to announce that the House Appropriations Subcommittee on Corrections and Judiciary will follow the uniform committee rules stated in Chapter 4 of our House rules and that were adopted on the House floor, and any applicable rules adopted by the House Appropriations Committee. And with that, Robin Risco is going to switch chairs and do a presentation for us, first on the Department of Corrections. Robin, take it away.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee. My name is Robin Risco. I work for the House Fiscal Agency, and I am the fiscal analyst responsible for the corrections and the judiciary budget. As the chair mentioned, I'm going to start off with an overview of the corrections budget. The budget is one of the bigger budgets, and the slide presentation before you is also rather lengthy. Don't worry, I'm not going to talk about everything on every slide. We have some new members on the committee, and I wanted to provide you with as much educational information as possible in this slide presentation for your reference. Moving to slide 3. Oops, I gotta do that. Okay. The Department of Corrections administers the state's adult prison, parole, and probation systems. Major departmental functions include operation of all state correctional institutions that house offenders who have been sentenced to prison. They monitor and supervise all parolees and probationers who are under the department's jurisdiction. And they oversee community corrections programs, offender success programs, and programs designed to encourage alternatives to prison placement for appropriate offenders. Now I will talk a little bit about funding for the department. On slide 5 shows you how the Department of Corrections budget compares to other areas of the state budget. Corrections makes up 3% of the state's $81.4 billion adjusted gross budget. Slide 6 shows you how the Department of Corrections budget compares to other areas of the state budget when it comes to the distribution of general fund dollars. Corrections makes up 14% of the state's total $14.9 billion general fund budget. Is there? Okay. Slide 7 shows you a history of how corrections spending has grown as a share of all state general fund spending. It was well below 5% in the early 1980s and is up to 14% today. This spending competes with other state priorities for state budget dollars, such as higher education, social services, and other public safety programs. Whoops. Total appropriations for the department have increased by roughly 8% since fiscal year 2011, driven mainly by employee costs and costs for programming and physical and mental health care for prisoners. In fiscal years 2020 through 2023, the department received federal disaster assistance and COVID relief funding primarily to offset GFGP allocations for payroll and frontline workers. I'll get to a chart here in a minute that gives you a little more detail on federal COVID funding received by the department. Slide 9 gives you a 5-year history of enacted appropriations and FTE positions. You can see from fiscal year 2021 to fiscal year 2025 that the budget increased by 86.6 million gross, 287.8 million general fund. There was a decrease of 475.8 FTE positions over this time. On the next slide, you'll see that the dollar and percent change amount from year to year over that time period. The significant change amount of general fund from fiscal year 21 to 22 can be attributed to restoration of $191 million of general fund revenue that was reduced from the FY21 budget and replaced with federal COVID relief funding. On slides 11 and 12, you will see the specific funding changes made to the budget over the past 5 years. The major components that make up these changes are listed. I'm not going to read all of them. I'll just highlight that the change from fiscal year 24 to fiscal year 25 was an increase of $67.5 million in 21 FTE positions. The change from fiscal year 23 to fiscal year 24 was a decrease of $50.6 million and a decrease of 308.4 FTE positions. A savings of $48.8 million and 427.4 FTEs resulted from the closure of the Michigan Reformatory and the south side of the Gus Harrison Correctional Facility that year. The change from fiscal year 22 to fiscal 23 was an increase of $74.7 million, 14 FTE positions. And the change from fiscal year 21 to fiscal year 22 was an increase of $196.1 million and a decrease of 202.4 FTEs. The increase, as I mentioned earlier, was due to restoring $191 million that was reduced from the fiscal year 21 budget and replaced with federal COVID relief dollars. The decrease in FTE positions can be attributed to closure of the Detroit Reentry Center that year. Slide 13 shows you all of the COVID relief funding that was appropriated by year to the department. The department received a total of $1.8 billion in federal COVID relief funds. In fiscal year 2020, funding was used primarily to support costs of hazard pay, personal protection equipment, and testing. Funding received in 22 and beyond was used to support payroll costs for frontline workers throughout the department, but primarily for costs for frontline workers at the facilities. The federal funding received was used to offset GFGP that would have otherwise been used to support the costs. Slide 14 shows you the appropriated levels for the current fiscal year 24-25 budget. The budget totals $2,147.4 million gross and $2,097 million general fund. The corrections budget is financed with $2.1 billion or 98% general fund, general purpose revenue. The next slide will show you more detail on the state restricted federal and local fund sources that support the budget. In the fiscal year 25 budget, state restricted revenue totals $33.5 million. Most restricted revenue supports costs of programs that actually generate the revenue. Examples would be revenues from prison industries and prison stores. Federal revenues from the U.S. Department of Justice totaled $5.2 million. Federal revenue includes grants for education, prison rape elimination, prisoner reintegration, incentive payments for identifying incarcerated recipients of supplemental security income, payments under the school breakfast and lunch programs for youth in prison, and reimbursements for housing foreign nationals and federal prisoners. Local revenues total $11.7 million. Most of that local revenue, $11.4 million, comes from the city of Detroit to support corrections staff at the Detroit Detention Center. Remaining local revenue comes from fees that are paid by local units of government for renting electronic monitoring equipment. Moving on to specific appropriation areas. The corrections budget is allocated into the following major spending areas: prison operations, operation of the state's correctional facilities, which includes physical and mental health care for prisoners, prisoner food service, prisoner behavioral programming, transportation, and staff training. There's parole and probation services, offender success services, which include education, job training, and career readiness programming for prisoners while they are incarcerated, community programs, and then departmental administration and support. Turning to slide 19, you'll see that over $1.6 billion, or 77% of the corrections $2.1 billion budget is allocated to prison operations, including physical and mental health care for prisoners. Prison operations is the largest spending component in the budget, followed by prisoner health care and then parole and probation services. I'm going to move on and talk a little bit about department employees. As of February, last month, 15th, the total number of active classified employees in the state's workforce was 49,088 people. Of those, 10,638, or 22%, were employed by the Department of Corrections. Slide 23 just gives you a look at the department's share of state employees compared to the total state workforce over the last 20 years. On slide 24, you will see the Department of Corrections has the greatest reliance of any other state department or agency on state general fund revenue to finance its personnel costs at 98.7%. Ironically, Judiciary is next in line at 95.3%. So roughly 42% of statewide general fund, general purpose financed personnel costs are paid by the Michigan Department of Corrections. Though MDOC employees make up 22% of the state's workforce, the department struggles to fill vacant positions and continues to be short-staffed. Vacancies occur throughout the department, but vacancies occur primarily with corrections officer positions. As of February 25, the department had 2,239 vacancies across all classifications. Of those, 967.4 were corrections officer vacancies, and 183.5 were registered nurse vacancies. Overtime costs are significant due to this understaffing issue. Historically, custody staff overtime hours account for anywhere between 93 and 100% of total overtime hours. The department continues to commit resources to recruitment and to staff retention, which is also another big challenge that the department faces. On slide 26, the chart shows you the number of overtime hours that were worked by MDOC employees over the last 10 years. Again, custody staff overtime hours account for the majority of overtime hours worked by department employees. A total of 2,572,496 overtime hours were worked in fiscal year 24 by department employees. Chart 27, slide 27, the chart shows you associated costs of the overtime hours that are worked by the department employees over the last 10 years. The department spent $118.2 million in fiscal year 24 for those 2.6 million hours of overtime hours that were worked. The department has been working to improve staffing levels and to reduce overtime. Key initiatives include researching the viability of traveling units of staff that can be deployed to most understaffed facilities, identifying and working to remove recruitment barriers, more targeted recruitment efforts, working to remove educational barriers, working with the legislature and the Civil Service Commission to provide recruitment and retention bonuses, and to allow employees to reach higher levels of pay in shorter amounts of time. Slide 29 shows you the number of recruitment events the department has held or attended over the last 9 years in an effort to reduce the number of staff vacancies. Moving to slide 30, typically the department runs one new employees school per quarter. The average number of enrollees in fiscal year 24 was 180. The first two academies for fiscal year 25 have started with 278 recruits. The chart shows you a breakdown of recruits enrolled in the Upper and Lower Peninsula academies. The October 24 academy class saw a 55% increase in attendance from the previous class. This was the largest incoming class since 2015. The Upper Peninsula class almost doubled from the previous class. Slide 31 gives you a snapshot of some interesting employee-related statistics. A number of you have asked various questions, and I thought maybe throwing this together might be of interest to you. I'd like to point out on September 28 of 2024, there were 10,222 department employees. Of those, 4,995 were corrections officers. Of those, 4,077 were male, 918 were female. If the department was fully staffed, there would be at least 10,700 FTEs in the facilities. The department loses on average between 90 and 100 employees per month to retirements and departures, and between 50 and 60 of those are corrections officers. Moving on to talk about the offender population. We've talked about prisoners, parolees, and probationers, so we'll move right on to slide 34. As of February 1, 2025, the total offender population under the department's supervision was 73,397 people. This is a decrease of 575 since the same time last year. Prisoners make up 32,574 of these people. The prisoner population peaked back in 2006 when there were 51,454 prisoners. Changes in the population are a function of the movement of offenders into and out of the system, meaning the number of admissions and then the length of stay. Slides 35 and 36 give you prison population statistics. Again, a number of you and your colleagues have asked for this information. Points of interest include 94% of the population is male, 6% is female, roughly 44% of the population is white, 56% is non-white, 75% of prisoners are in prison for the first time, 25% are serving their second or subsequent prison sentence. The average minimum sentence for non-lifers is a little over 5 years. Roughly 13% of the population is serving a life sentence. 87% of the population is expected to be released. Currently, there are 4,221 prisoners who are past their earliest release date. Between 500 and 700 prisoners are paroled each month, and the department is currently housing 420 foreign nationals. The department is currently housing 8 prisoners in federal institutions. The department is currently housing 2 federal prisoners for the Federal Bureau of Prisons. On average, there are 4 to 6 pregnant prisoners at any given time. In the first quarter of fiscal 25, there were 12 prisoners under the age of 18, 70 prisoners between the ages of 18 and 23. 18% of male prisoners and 36% of female prisoners have a severe mental illness, and 65% of those prisoners have a history of significant substance use disorder. There is on average 12 prisoner deaths per month. Drug overdoses, homicides, and suicides are the top non-medical causes of death, whereas cancer and cardiovascular disease are the first and second leading medical causes of death, respectively. Currently, there are 201 active oncology patients, 86 prisoners in hospice care, 59 prisoners receiving dialysis. 65% of prisoners are on at least one medication. There are about 100,000 prescriptions filled each month for roughly 21,000 prisoners. On slide 37, I talk about prison population growth and projections. I won't go through all of this, but I would like to point out that according to the most recent prison population projection report submitted by the department, the number of prisoners is expected to flatten after reaching pre-COVID levels in early 2025. Now we'll talk a little bit about the facilities. The department operates 26 facilities currently located in 19 counties across the state. In addition, the department operates the Special Alternative Incarceration Program and the Detroit Detention Center. Over $1.6 billion, or 77%, of the fiscal year 25 corrections budget is devoted to costs pertaining to prisoner custody. These costs include housing, physical and mental health care, food, transportation, and behavioral treatment programs. Academic and vocational programming appropriations, roughly $58.8 million in the fiscal year 25 budget, are included in appropriations for offender success instead of in appropriations for prisoner custody. Slide 40 just shows you a map of where all the correctional facilities are located throughout the state. As I mentioned earlier, the total fiscal '25 appropriation for prisoner custody care and programming is $1.7 billion. The largest spending component is correctional facilities at $1.1 billion, followed by physical health care at $307.7 million. Slide 42 shows you costs of prisoners, per prisoner based on their security level. As a prisoner's level of security needs increases, the cost for caring for that prisoner also increases. The chart on slide 43 reviews total prison operations spending, excluding spending for physical and mental health care, which you'll see on the next slide. Per prisoner costs grew by an average of 1.6% per year over this period. The decrease in spending in more recent years can be attributed to the COVID pandemic and to the increasing number of staff vacancies. In fiscal year '24, the overall daily per diem rate per prisoner was $137.44. If you add these operational costs to the healthcare cost per prisoner on the next slide, you're looking at a total average cost of roughly $46,000 per prisoner annually in fiscal year '24. The U.S. Constitution and federal court orders obligate the department to provide health care to prisoners in a manner that is not deliberately indifferent. Health care is provided on-site at prison clinics by MDOC employees as well as by providers that are hired under contract. The department contracts for off-site hospital and specialty care services. Off-site hospitals with dedicated DOC wings include Henry Ford Allegiance in Jackson and McLaren in Lansing. There are on-site infirmaries at the Egler, Marquette, Women's Huron Valley, and Woodland facilities. The department also uses local ER departments if it has to, but these aren't dedicated MDOC spaces, so when they do that, they also have to provide the custody coverage. According to the department, prior to incarceration, most prisoners did not receive regular medical, dental, or mental health care. So when their health status is considered, prisoners are roughly 10 years older than their chronological age. Spending on health care puts a lot of pressure on the state's budget. Slide 45, one major factor in the rise of per prisoner health care costs is the aging of the prison population. In 2008, 43% of prisoners were over age 40 and 17.8% were over age 50. By 2024, those percentages increased significantly to 52.1% over age 40 and 28.2% over age 50. Talked about field operations earlier. In the presentation, we talked about parole and probation being the third largest spending category following prison operations and healthcare. The field operations budget totals about $276 million when you include parole board operations, other parole and probation specific programs, and community programs designed for parolees and probationers. As of October 24, the department employed 1,008 active parole and probation agents responsible for supervising 40,575 offenders. There are 3 intensive detention centers in the state, one in Ingham County, one in Clinton County, one the Macomb Parole Violation Unit. These provide additional programming and/or intensive detention that is needed to increase the likelihood of success. Programming includes substance abuse, violence prevention, and cognitive behavioral programming, to name a few. Electronic tethers, substance abuse testing and treatment services, criminal justice reinvestment programs, and the residential alternative to prison program are programs that serve as alternatives to incarceration for offenders who meet certain eligibility requirements. The Electronic Monitoring Center is located here in Lansing and operates 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. The center monitors offenders who are assigned to tethers as a condition of release. As of February 1, there were 2,914 offenders on tethers monitored by the department. 1,835 of them were parolees and 1,079 of them were probationers. Slide 48 shows you how the $276 million appropriation is allocated. As far as the parole board process goes, prisoners are seen 3 to 4 months prior to their parole eligible date. The parole board looks at a lot of factors when making determinations. These include social mental attitude, behavior while they're in prison, the nature of their offense, their criminal history, sentencing guidelines, scores, the victim, program performance, their age, their health, their risk to society. If a prisoner is denied parole, they are generally reviewed again in 12 to 18 months. They're told the reasons why their parole was denied, and then they're given opportunities to work on improving their chances of being granted parole the next time they're reviewed. The parole board consists of 10 members that are appointed by the director. They serve 4-year terms. There's a staff of roughly 31 people that assist with case preparation, crime victim services, and then interstate compact issues. The typical parole term for an offender is about 2 years. This slide just shows you average parole and probation populations over time. Parolees serve at least their minimum sentence and are released to a period of supervision. Probationers have been sentenced to a term of supervision in the community after or instead of a jail sentence. Both are supervised by MDOC field agents. Local courts retain legal control over the status of probationers while the parole board controls parolees. Probation and parole officers are state employees up in the UP and in some rural areas of the state. An agent may handle both parole and probation cases. This chart shows you, like I said, the population over time. Spending for parole and probation has increased by an average of a little over 1.6% annually since fiscal 2010. The cost per offender increased by an average of a little over 6.6% per year over the same period. The use of electronic monitoring techniques significantly increased starting in 2010. The last topic I'll talk about is offender success. Offender success programs and services aim to reduce recidivism through prisoner assessment, case planning and management, and coordinated services from the time of entry into prison through aftercare in the community. The programs involve state departments, local law enforcement, crime victims advocates, faith-based organizations, and community business partners. The fiscal year 25 budget includes $94.2 million in appropriations for offender success, and of that, $58.8 million is allocated for education, job training, and career readiness programming for prisoners while they are incarcerated. The department works with prisoners to complete their high school equivalency. They offer career and technical education programs, including welding, carpentry, food tech, hospitality, cement and masonry, commercial driver's license, forklift, optical, and horticulture. The department operates 3 vocational villages offering skilled trades programs. Vocational villages are located at Richard Hanlon and Ionia, Parnell and Jackson, and the Women's Huron Valley and Ypsilanti. Programs in vocational villages include CNC machining, robotics, auto tech, diesel mechanics, carpentry, cement and masonry, computer coding, commercial driver's license, additive manufacturing, cosmetology, and welding. The department offers higher education programs and partners with post-secondary schools that offer classes to prisoners at the facilities. I think there's actively working with 9 4-year schools right now, 4 2-year schools for a total of 13, and they're expecting 1 more to go on board here in 25. Prisoners obtain degrees upon successful completion. The department offers employment readiness programming, including soft and practical skills, digital literacy, financial literacy, resume writing, and they conduct mock interviews. On slide 54 shows you a history of funding expended for offender success programming over the last 15 years. And now, to sum it all up, The fiscal year 25 corrections budget totals $2.1 billion. Corrections makes up about 14% of the state's total general fund general purpose budget, the second largest share next to the Department of Health and Human Services. The corrections budget is dominated by personnel costs. Salary and benefit levels of state employees are negotiated between the state employer and the 5 unions that represent department employees and cannot be controlled by the legislature. Under the U.S. Constitution and federal court orders, the department is obligated to provide health care to prisoners in a manner that is not deliberately indifferent. The aging prison population and rising prisoner health care costs have been a key driver of budget growth. So the public wants reduced spending on corrections and a reduced burden on taxpayers. The public wants to shift the revenue spent on corrections to other budget priorities, and at the same time, the public wants offenders who pose risks to public safety to be locked up and stay locked up. These present challenges for you as state legislators. And that concludes my overview presentation. I'd be happy to answer any questions you may have. Mr. Chair, if I may, I would like to thank the Department of Corrections for their help in answering my many questions and providing me with all of this statistical data that I could respond to your questions with. So thank you. I appreciate it.
Thanks, thanks, Robin. It was like a gust coming away from you with all of this stuff and all the details and how fast you were able to get through that. Thank you. I saw the 50-some pages, and I'm like, oh my gosh, we're going to be here until tomorrow. So thanks. We'll start down here on the end. Cam.
Yep. Thank you, Robin. Well done. I'm seeing in the news media and things where local ambulance services are not being reimbursed by Department of Corrections for trips into the penitentiaries and things, and it's causing problems in rural areas. Is there a part in the budget where you could explain to me where that money's at that they're supposed to be reimbursing local governments for ambulance runs into facilities and things?
So in response to that question, in the healthcare unit, there's a line item which has funding for the prisoner health care, for the provider that they contract with for prisoner health care services. The department changed their provider back in, I believe it was May of '24. There were some issues with the previous provider, and that is now in court. I'm not totally up to speed on exactly where that is in the process, but the money was given, the money was there in the budget to pay what was agreed to in the contract with the provider.
Thank you, Robin.
Rep. O'Neill.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, Robin, for just a thorough report. As you know, this is a major expenditure we all have, and I really want to commend the department for, working in a, cooperative way with us to try to create opportunities for these inmates to be better when they're released. I think that's important. I just want to ask about the prosperity regions, 1 and 4, and then 2, 7, and 8. Can you kind of let me know where those exactly are? Yes, I'm sorry. The exec rec includes 1.8 million GF for GP to expand the number of probationers' eligibility to receive those reentry services currently for the prosperity regions, and it has 1 and 4, and then 2 and 7 and 8. I just want to make sure we can know where those areas are.
I will have, if we're allowed to ask the department, because I do not have that information with me right now. I'm sorry.
Kyle, please, if you've got information for us, we'd love it.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee. Kyle Kaminsky from the Department of Corrections, and while we'll reserve our conversation about the exec rec for a future date to answer the very specific question, Region 1 is all of the Upper Peninsula. Region 4 is West Michigan, kind of anchored by Kent County, but also moving north through Muskegon and all those surrounding counties. The remaining regions that are mentioned, 2, 7, and 8, essentially are moving west to east across the state. So that would be Southwest Michigan, kind of Northwest Michigan, so kind of up here. And then Region 7 is the capital region. So that's Clinton, Ingham, and Eaton counties. So that proposal has us kind of building west to east in terms of those services.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chair.
Mr. Beeson.
Thank you, Chair Slaw, and thanks, Robin, for this. On page 26, the MDOC overtime employee hours, by chance, did you have it in there how many of those hours are mandated versus just worked hours? No, you don't. Okay. But we will get that when we get the questions from the over. Okay. I mean, when the director gets up there, thank you.
So I have one question for you, Robin. In the healthcare line item, is there, you showed that we were short a whole bunch of nurses, RNs, in this process. And so is there an amount in that healthcare that's actually RNs that we're using from outside somehow that are coming in? I don't know, how do we fill those gaps if those people aren't there?
Yes, the department does contract with outside providers when they can't get state employees to perform, enough state employees to perform the services. The issue is, and you'll see this, increases, especially like in the 26 budget, there's a request because they pay between 17 and 19% more. They have to pay between 17 and 19% more when they contract for RNs and LPNs versus if those were civil service employees. So there is money in the budget. They use the money that they have in those line items. And they have that money because even though they're paying more and they have to ask you for a little bit more, there's enough vacant positions, so there's money freed up basically to pay for the contracted positions.
With that, I have no more questions that are apparent at this point in time. Thank you for your service in that budget. And I understand we're going to transition, give you 30 seconds to recalibrate and get to Judiciary. You obviously wowed the crowd enough so that they're all leaving, so.
All right. Before we start, I'd like to mention that the judiciary budget is a bit different from all other state departments' budgets. It's important to keep in mind that it is its own branch of government, and it's important to recognize and remember that the issue of separation of powers. The legislature appropriates funding for operations of the judicial branch, but the legislature cannot mandate the actions of justices or judges. Moving on to slide 3. Authority for the judicial branch of government is granted by Article 6, Section 1 of the Constitution of the State of Michigan. The Constitution gives judicial power to the Supreme Court, the Court of Appeals, and to trial courts. Moving to slide 5. You can see where judiciary fits into the total state budget picture. It's definitely one of the smaller budgets. It's less than 1% of the state's $81.4 billion adjusted gross budget. Slide 6 shows you where judiciary fits into the total state GF picture. Again, the budget is one of the smaller budgets, representing 2% of the state's $14.9 billion GF budget. Then I go too far. Funding for judiciary has grown by a little over 44% since fiscal year 2011. Substantial growth in fiscal year 23 was due to a one-time appropriation of $150 million to support a new statewide judicial case management system. In prior years, growth was due primarily to expansion of problem-solving courts and other programs that offer community alternatives to prison. On slide 8, there's a 5-year history of appropriations and FTE positions. You can see from fiscal year 21 to fiscal year 25, the budget increased by 59.5 million gross, 64.2 million general fund, and 130.5 FTE positions. On the next slide, you'll see the dollar and percent change amounts over the 5-year period by year. The significant change amounts shown for fiscal years 23 and 24 are a result of that one-time appropriation of 150 million that I just mentioned back on slide 7. On this and the next slide, again, you'll see the specific funding changes made to the budget over the past 5 years. The change from fiscal 24 to 25 was an increase of 13.8 million in 45 FTE positions. The change from fiscal 23 to 24 was a reduction of 120.2 million and an increase of 55 FTEs. The large reduction was a result of removing 151.4 million total in one-time funding that was included in the FY23 budget. The major change from fiscal year 22 to fiscal year 23 was an increase of $163.1 million and 19.5 FTEs. This large increase, again, it can be attributed to that one-time appropriation of 150 million. The change from fiscal year 21 to fiscal year 22 was an increase of 7.4 million and 11 FTE positions. Slide 12 shows you appropriated levels for the current fiscal year 24-25 budget. The budget totals 373.4 million in gross appropriations and 266.1 million in general fund. The next slide goes into more detail on the fund sources. The judiciary budget is funded 97% with state general fund and state restricted funding. There's 14 state restricted fund sources in the budget. 5 main ones are the court equity fund at 50.4 million, the judicial electronic filing fund at 12 million, the state court fund at 8.4 million, and the juror compensation fund at 6.6 million. The 7.1 million in federal funding comes from 10 different fund sources. The largest source is various grant money coming from the Department of Health and the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services. It's 3.7 million. The second largest is from the U.S. Department of Transportation, the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration at 2.3 million. IDG funding totals 2.4 million. 1.8 of that comes from the federal burn grant funding that's administered by the State Department of State Police and then passed through to Judiciary. It's used to support drug treatment courts and drunk driving programs. Private funds come from primarily the State Justice Institute, the Michigan Justice Fund, and interest on lawyers' trust accounts. Moving to specific appropriation areas, the judiciary budget is allocated into the following major spending areas: the Supreme Court, the Court of Appeals, trial court operations, justice and judges' compensation, indigent defense, indigent civil legal assistance, Judicial Tenure Commission, and branch-wide appropriations. On slide 16, you'll see the total 373.4 million appropriated in the judiciary budget. Of it, 302.2 million, or 81%, supports justices and judges' compensation, the Supreme Court, and trial court operation. Specifically, 33% for judicial salaries, 24% for the Supreme Court, 24% for trial court operations. Smaller parts of the budget consist of indigent defense at 8% and the Court of Appeals at 7%. Of the total 266.1 million in general fund that's appropriated, 120.9 million, or 45% of that, supports justices and judges' compensation. I'm going to talk more about that, the compensation, in a few minutes. Moving to slide 19. The next 5 slides talk about all the different courts in Michigan. The court system, as I mentioned, has 3 levels: the Supreme Court, the Court of Appeals, and trial courts. The Supreme Court is the state's highest court and has the final word on state law. There are 7 Supreme Court justices elected to 8-year terms. The Court of Appeals hears appeals from trial courts and has 25 Court of Appeals judges elected to 6-year terms. Trial courts are where all the facts are decided. There are jurors and witnesses, and they are located in every county across the state. Circuit courts have the broadest powers. They handle all civil cases with claims more than $25,000 and all felony criminal cases. They handle appeals from district courts and administrative appeals. There are 57 circuit courts in the state, 221 circuit court judges elected to 6-year terms. Also within the circuit court is the family division, and then the friend of the court is part of the family division. Probate courts handle wills, administer estates and trusts, appoint guardians and conservators, order treatment for mentally ill and developmentally disabled persons. There are 78 probate courts in Michigan, 104 probate court judges that are elected to 6-year terms. District courts handle most traffic violations, civil cases with claims up to $25,000, small claims up to $6,500, landlord-tenant matters, ordinance violations, all misdemeanor criminal cases, and the preliminary stages of felony criminal cases. There are 100 district courts in Michigan, 232 district court judges elected to 6-year terms. Municipal courts handle misdemeanor criminal cases, preliminary stages of felony criminal cases, civil cases up to $1,500 or $3,000 if resolution exists, traffic and parking infractions. They have limited powers and are located only in Grosse Pointe Farms, Grosse Pointe Park, and Grosse Pointe Shores, and Grosse Pointe Woods. The Court of Claims handles cases filed against the state of Michigan and its agencies. Cases include highway defect, medical malpractice, contracts, constitutional claims, prisoner litigation, tax-related suits, other claims for money damages over $1,000. In Michigan, there are 2 federal district courts. There are no state appropriations, though, that are used to support the federal courts. The judges on those courts are nominated by the president and then confirmed by the U.S. Senate. There are 12 tribal courts. Again, no state appropriations are used to support tribal courts. Tribal courts resolve civil, criminal, and other legal matters within Indian jurisdiction. Michigan's state courts ensure mutual recognition of state and tribal court judgments according to Michigan Court Rule 2.615. And now, slide 24 shows you the cost of state salaries for Supreme Court justices and court judges. The Constitution requires the State Officers' Compensation Commission to determine salaries for Supreme Court justices. Salaries for judges of the Court of Appeals and judges of the circuit, probate, and district courts are determined by the Revised Judicature Act of 1961. Prior to 2016, salaries for judges were based on a percentage of the salary paid to a justice of the Supreme Court. Then, effective January 1 of 2016, the Revised Judicature Act was amended to change salary calculations of a calculations for judges. Amendments required that salaries equal a percentage of the salary of a Supreme Court justice as of December 31st, 2015, plus an amount based on percentage pay increases, excluding lump sum payments that are paid to civil service, non-exclusively represented employees classified as executives and administrators. Effective October 1 of 22, there was another amendment to the Revised Judicature Act, and that required that the salary of a district court judge equal that of a probate court judge. So in fiscal year 2024, the state spent about $101.3 million on salaries for justices and judges. In addition to that, the cost of salaries, they paid a little over $7.1 million for associated FICA expenses and a little over $7.1 million for associated retirement costs. Salaries of Supreme Court justices, Court of Appeals judges, and district court judges are paid 100% with general fund dollars. Salaries of circuit court and probate court judges are paid primarily with general fund, but there's also a portion of state restricted court fee fund revenue that pays those salaries. Slide 25, you'll see that besides justice and judges' compensation, the other primary component of the funding in the budget is for grant programs to assist local trial courts. It costs a little bit over $1 billion annually to operate the state's trial courts, and local court funding units pay for almost half of those costs, but the state pays roughly 30%, and then the balance is paid with federal funding and funding that's contributed by the trial courts themselves. $124.1 million, or about 33% of the judiciary budget, is appropriated for various grant programs and reimbursements to local units. Primary among these is the Court Equity Fund Reimbursement Program. $60.8 million gross is used to assist local trial courts with operational expenses. Funding from the Court Equity Fund is combined with general fund, and it's distributed to counties quarterly under a statutory formula that recognizes caseload activity and number of judgeships that are allocated to each county. The Court Equity Fund consists of state court fund revenues set aside for operational expenses of trial courts, proceeds of costs that are assessed by district courts, and certain court fees. The other major grant programs in the judiciary budget are the problem-solving courts. These include the drug treatment courts, the mental health treatment courts, and veterans treatment courts. Drug treatment courts receive about $13 million. They operate to rehabilitate offenders diagnosed with substance use disorders. They offer an alternative to imprison for nonviolent criminal offenders. There are 134 drug treatment courts operating in the state. Mental health courts get about $5.7 million. They target offenders who have been diagnosed with serious mental illnesses, serious emotional disturbances, or developmental disabilities. They offer opportunities to participate in court-based treatment programs to address their mental illnesses instead of sentencing them to lengthy jail or prison terms. There are 39 mental health courts operating in the state. Veterans courts get about $1.1 million in gross appropriations. They use a hybrid integration of drug treatment court and mental health court principles to promote sobriety, recovery, and stability. They also work in collaboration with the United States Department of Veterans Affairs. There are 27 veterans treatment courts operating in the state. And the last grant program that I'd like to mention is the Swift and Sure Sanctions Probation Program, which gets about $3.4 million. Funding for this program is used to provide a high-intensity supervision, close monitoring, and then swift sanctions in the event of probation violations. The program focuses on high-risk felony offenders. As of December 31 of 2024, there were 21 circuit courts that received grant funding under this program. I'd also like to mention at this point that participation in any of these grant programs is left to the discretion of the judges, and the state cannot mandate that judges operate these programs. Slide 28 just shows you a 10-year history of funding that's been appropriated for each of these different problem-solving courts. And then the last two slides, I just want to touch briefly on the other two major areas of the budget. The State Appellate Defender Office, $22.2 million is appropriated for that office. They operate under statute and the Sixth Amendment of the United States Constitution to represent indigent people that are appealing criminal convictions. SATO is comprised of 3 divisions: the Public Defender Division, which represents at least 25% of individuals that are appealing their convictions; the Michigan Appellate Assigned Counsel System, which appoints criminal appellate counsel in all state circuit courts; and then the Criminal Defense Resource Center, which provides training and resources to the state's court-appointed trial and appellate counsel. And last but not least, there's the Judicial Tenure Commission. About $2.9 million is appropriated for this commission. It's a 9-member commission that was established in the Constitution, consists of 4 judges, 3 members elected by the state bar, and 2 members appointed by the governor. The commission holds judges accountable for their misconduct. They investigate complaints against judges, and where appropriate, they recommend disciplinary action. Subject matter of grievances includes prejudice, partiality, demeanor, review of legal ruling, failure to perform duties, misconduct, and delay. And, whoops, I'm sorry. That's the end of that presentation. I'm happy to answer questions if you have them.
Thank you, Robin. Appreciate that. Looks like I'm the only one with questions at the moment. I have a question for you on page 13, slide 13. You were talking about sources of funds. And you, I think, I heard you correctly, you said that there's a highways, something about highways or something that is a fund source?
Correct. The U.S. Department of Transportation National Highway Traffic Safety Administration. That's the federal name of the division within the U.S. Department of Transportation. They give,
Is there a specific place where those funds go?
yes, they are targeted at drug treatment courts and then for drunk driving programs
Interesting. Okay, thank you.
within the courts.
And then I had a question for you about the Supreme Court justices' salaries. When was the last time they were, do you know if they were recommended for increases?
They've been recommended. In fact, they were recommended, and there was a House resolution that you passed last session.
Okay,
I can't remember all the details. It was 7%, I want to say, with a $10,000 expense allowance.
okay.
It has to be approved by resolution in both chambers. It made it through the House but did not pass the Senate.
Okay, thank you. Anything else? Thanks, Robin, appreciate that. Appreciate all of your wisdom and your insight as you went through that. Let's see. Are there additional questions? Anything that members of the committee would like to speak to? Good. All right, so with that, we will adjourn this subcommittee, and we are adjourned.